There are moments when heaven is not moved by the noise you made, but by the silence you chose, and before you decide to scroll away, hear this truth with your spirit wide awake. There are battles you never announced, arguments you never entered, answers you never released, and words you swallowed in faith that shook the unseen realm more than any shout ever could. Because restraint born of trust is louder than confidence born of pride, and what you didn't say carried a weight that eternity itself noticed. You live in a world that rewards reaction, celebrates response, and demands that you always have something to prove, something to defend, something to say. Yet God watches differently, not with the eyes of impatience, but with the eyes of wisdom. And he is not impressed by volume, by quick replies, or by sharp tongues, but by hearts so anchored in him that they can afford to be still when everything around them is screaming for a reaction. You thought silence meant weakness, but God saw it as strength refined by faith. You thought holding your peace meant you lost the moment, but God marked it as a victory you didn't even know you were winning. There were times when accusations flew toward you like arrows, and your mind formed 1,000 perfect responses, each one sharper than the last, each one capable of silencing the other side. But something within you hesitated, not fear, not confusion, but a quiet restraint that said, trust God more than your need to be understood. And in that moment, when you closed your mouth and opened your spirit, God leaned in. He was not waiting for your defense. He was watching your trust. He was not measuring your eloquence. He was measuring your surrender. Understand this deeply. God is not impressed by how well you argue your case when he is already your judge, your witness, and your defender. Every time you chose silence over self-justification, you declared without words that God is enough to speak for you. That declaration rose higher than any speech you could have given. Heaven records not only what is said, but what is withheld in obedience. Silence offered in faith is not empty, it is full of power. You didn't speak when you were misunderstood, and people assumed you had nothing to say, but God knew you had everything to say and chose restraint instead. You didn't correct every false narrative, didn't expose every lie, didn't broadcast your pain for sympathy. And while others mistook your quietness for defeat, God recognized it as maturity. There is a level of spiritual growth where you no longer feel the need to explain yourself to everyone, because you know God already understands you fully, and that understanding is sufficient. There were moments when anger knocked on the door of your heart, demanding expression, urging release, promising relief if you would only let it out. But you paused, you breathed, you remembered God. You remembered that not every emotion deserves a voice, and not every thought deserves a platform. That pause, that single breath of restraint became an offering. God saw it. He was impressed not by the fire you felt, but by the discipline you exercised. The world trains you to believe that power is proven by how loudly you speak, how quickly you respond, how decisively you dominate conversations. But God's economy is different. In his kingdom, power is often revealed through control, through patience, through the ability to remain steady when provoked. When you didn't speak out of impulse, when you refused to let your tongue outrun your spirit, you aligned yourself with divine wisdom, and that alignment did not go unnoticed. There were prayers you wanted to shout, complaints you wanted to voice, frustrations you wanted validated. Yet instead of flooding the world with your struggles, you carried them quietly before God. You chose prayer over performance. You chose trust over display. And while no one applauded that choice, heaven responded. God is drawn to hearts that seek him in private more than they seek affirmation in public. What you didn't say publicly became what God addressed powerfully in secret. You see, silence does not mean passivity when it is rooted in faith. It means you have learned that God can do more in one moment than you can do in a lifetime of explanation. When you didn't argue, God moved. When you didn't retaliate, God defended. When you didn't complain, God strengthened. Your restraint made room for his intervention. Your quietness invited his action. There is a sacred discipline in holding your tongue when every fiber of your being wants to speak, and that discipline shapes your character in ways words never could. God is not shaping you to be loud. He is shaping you to be deep. He is not forming you to react. He is forming you to discern. Every time you resisted the urge to speak prematurely, you demonstrated trust in God's timing. And timing is something God honors profoundly. You didn't say what you could have said, and that choice protected you from consequences you never saw coming. Words have power not only to build but to destroy, not only to heal but to wound. And when you withheld words that would have satisfied your emotions but harmed your future, God smiled. He saw a person who values destiny over momentary relief. He saw a heart willing to suffer misunderstanding rather than sabotage purpose. There were conversations where silence was your shield. You didn't reveal everything you knew, didn't expose every flaw you noticed, didn't highlight every injustice you endured, and in doing so, you avoided becoming what hurt you. God is impressed by those who refuse to mirror the negativity around them. When you chose silence instead of spreading bitterness, you broke a cycle. Heaven takes notice when cycles are broken. You may not realize this, but there are spiritual promotions that come not from what you accomplish outwardly, but from what you master inwardly. The tongue is one of the hardest things to govern. And when you learn to pause it, to restrain it, to submit it to God, you demonstrated readiness for greater responsibility. God does not entrust influence to those who cannot control their words, because words shape worlds. What you didn't say when you were hurt showed God that your identity is not fragile. What you didn't say when you were provoked showed him that your peace is not negotiable. What you didn't say when you were tempted to complain showed him that your gratitude runs deeper than your circumstances. These unspoken choices formed a testimony louder than any declaration. There is a mystery to silence that many never understand. Silence can be an act of faith. Silence can be a prayer. Silence can be obedience. When you held your peace, you were not ignoring reality, you were entrusting it to God. And trust is the language God responds to most swiftly. He does not need you to narrate every detail he already knows. What he desires is your confidence that he is working even when you are not speaking. You withheld words that could have escalated conflict, and in doing so, you became a peacemaker without saying a thing. God values peace deeply, not the kind that avoids truth, but the kind that trusts him to handle truth at the right time. You understood that some truths are not meant to be shouted, but carried patiently until God releases them. That understanding reflects wisdom beyond years. There were times when silence cost you. Popularity cost you, recognition cost you the satisfaction of being right. But what you gained was something far greater: God's approval. The approval of heaven outweighs the applause of people. God is not impressed by how many agree with you. He is impressed by how faithfully you obey him, even when obedience is quiet and unseen. Every unspoken word that you surrendered became a seed. Seeds buried in silence eventually produce fruit that speaks for itself. You didn't need to announce your growth, your healing, your progress, because God was cultivating it beneath the surface. And when the fruit appears, it will speak louder than any explanation you could have offered. There is a strength that comes from knowing when not to speak, and that strength is forged in trust. You trusted God to vindicate you. You trusted him to reveal truth. You trusted him to handle what you could not control. That trust impressed him deeply. Faith is not only shown in what you say you believe, but in how you behave when belief is tested. You resisted the urge to defend yourself against every misunderstanding, and in doing so, you declared that your worth is not dependent on others' opinions. God is drawn to those who know who they are in him. When you are secure in God, you don't panic when people misunderstand you. You don't rush to correct every false perception. You remain steady, knowing that truth has a way of rising without your force. Silence trained your spirit to listen. While others were busy speaking, you were learning. While others were reacting, you were discerning. God often speaks in moments of stillness, and because you created space by not speaking, you were able to hear what others missed. That listening posture positioned you for guidance that words would have drowned out. You didn't say what you felt in the heat of the moment, and that saved you from regrets that haunt many. God sees the long view. He knows the impact of words spoken in haste. And when you chose patience over impulse, you aligned yourself with his wisdom. Wisdom is not loud. Wisdom waits. There were prayers you prayed without words, tears you shed without explanation, battles you fought internally without announcement, and God saw them all. He is not moved by public displays of faith as much as he is moved by private endurance. What you didn't say became a testimony of endurance, of perseverance, of trust that does not need an audience. You may wonder if your silence mattered, if God noticed, if it made any difference at all. Hear this clearly. Nothing offered in faith is ever overlooked by God. Every restrained word was recorded. Every moment of self-control was counted. Every choice to trust instead of speak was honored. God is a witness to the unseen sacrifices that shape a person's destiny. When you didn't speak out of fear, you showed courage. When you didn't speak out of anger, you showed strength. When you didn't speak out of pride, you showed humility. These are qualities God values deeply. They cannot be faked, and they cannot be produced overnight. They are formed through countless small decisions to yield to God rather than to impulse. Your silence protected your spirit. Words spoken carelessly have a way of lingering, of reopening wounds, of complicating healing. By choosing silence, you allowed healing to progress without interference. God desires wholeness for you, and sometimes wholeness requires restraint more than release. There is a divine timing to everything, including speech. You sensed that timing and honored it. You understood that not everything needs to be addressed immediately, that some things are better left in God's hands until clarity emerges. That patience reflects spiritual maturity. God entrusts deeper matters to those who can wait. You didn't say what would have satisfied your ego, and that choice humbled you in ways that elevated you spiritually. Humility attracts God's attention, not the kind that belittles itself, but the kind that trusts God to lift you at the right time. You chose to let God do the lifting, and that pleased Him. Your silence was not empty, it was full of prayer, full of faith, full of surrender. It was an active choice, not a passive one. You actively chose to trust God with your voice. That trust impressed Him more than eloquence ever could. There were moments when silence felt heavy, when you questioned whether you should have spoken, whether staying quiet was the right decision. But even in that uncertainty, you leaned toward trust. God honors those who choose trust even when clarity is incomplete. Faith does not always have all the answers, it simply knows where to place the questions. You didn't say what you could have said, and in doing so, you preserved relationships that words might have damaged beyond repair. God values reconciliation, peace, and unity. By choosing silence over sharpness, you became an instrument of peace without ever announcing it. What you didn't say kept your heart soft. Harsh words hardened the heart of the speaker as much as they wound the listener. By restraining your tongue, you protected your own spirit from becoming bitter. God is concerned not only with what comes out of your mouth, but with what remains alive within your heart. You trusted God to fight battles you could not win with words. You trusted Him to reveal truth without your force. You trusted Him to heal wounds without your explanations. That trust is rare, and rarity draws God's attention. Silence taught you to rely on God rather than on your own ability to persuade, explain, or control outcomes. That reliance deepened your faith. Faith grows strongest when it is exercised in the unseen, in moments where no one is watching and no applause is given. You didn't speak when silence required courage, and that courage reshaped you. It made you less reactive, more discerning, less driven by emotion, more anchored in faith. God is shaping you into someone who moves with wisdom rather than impulse, and that shaping process often happens in silence. There are rewards that come not from what you say, but from what you resist saying. You resisted bitterness. You resisted retaliation. You resisted the urge to justify yourself endlessly. Those resistances strengthened your spirit. God strengthens those who choose restraint for His sake. What you didn't say became an act of worship. It said, "Without words, God, I trust you with my voice, my reputation, my story." That surrender touched heaven. God is moved by surrender more than by performance. You may never fully know how many times your silence shifted outcomes, prevented harm, or opened doors you didn't even see. But God knows. He sees the ripple effects of obedience that extend far beyond the moment. He sees how your restraint today shapes your future tomorrow. Your silence was not ignored. It was heard in heaven. It spoke of faith that does not need validation, of trust that does not need explanation, of obedience that does not need recognition. And that kind of faith leaves an impression on God that words alone never could. And understand this as the truth settles deeper into your spirit. Silence did not make you invisible to God, it made you visible in a way noise never could. When you withdrew your words, you did not withdraw your faith. You concentrated it. You distilled it. You allowed it to rise without interference. God does not need commentary to recognize loyalty. He discerns alignment, weighs intention. He reads the posture of the heart long before he listens to the sound of the mouth. There are dimensions of trust that can only be entered through restraint. Anyone can speak when emotions are high, but only those anchored in God can remain steady when provoked. That steadiness is not natural, it is cultivated. It is forged through repeated decisions to submit the urge to speak to the wisdom of waiting. Each time you waited, you strengthened an inner muscle that few are willing to develop. God sees that strength, and He values it deeply. You live in an age of exposure where everything is shared instantly, where privacy is mistaken for secrecy and silence is mistaken for guilt. Yet God still honors those who can keep sacred things sacred. Not every experience is meant to be verbalized. Not every burden is meant to be broadcast. Some things are entrusted to you so they can be carried quietly with God. When you honored that trust, you demonstrated reverence, and reverence always draws God's attention. There is a difference between silence born of fear and silence born of faith. Fear is silent because it feels powerless. Faith is silent because it knows God is powerful. When you chose not to speak, not because you were intimidated, but because you were confident in God, you stepped into a higher posture of faith. That posture says, God is already handling what I am tempted to explain. And God responds to that kind of confidence with favor. You didn't say everything you knew, and that showed wisdom. Knowledge seeks expression, but wisdom seeks timing. God is not impressed by how much you know. He is impressed by how well you steward what you know. By keeping certain truths within you until the right moment, you protected both yourself and others. God entrusts deeper understanding to those who can carry it without misusing it. There were moments when speaking would have given you temporary relief, but lasting consequences. You sensed that weight. You felt that warning. You chose restraint. That choice revealed discernment, and discernment is a gift God refines through obedience. Every time you honored that inner warning, you sharpened your spiritual sensitivity. God speaks more clearly to those who listen more than they speak. Your silence also revealed where your trust truly lies. When you stop trying to manage outcomes with words, you allow God to manage them with power. Words can influence people, but God influences reality itself. When you step back from verbal control, you stepped into divine order. God moves most freely when you stop trying to orchestrate everything with your voice. You may not realize how many unseen conflicts were resolved simply because you refused to escalate them. Words can ignite fires that take years to extinguish. By withholding them, you prevented damage that no apology could have fully repaired. God values those who prevent destruction as much as those who rebuild afterward. Prevention requires foresight, and foresight comes from walking closely with God. Silence also exposed your priorities. You decided that peace mattered more than proving a point. You decided that integrity mattered more than winning an argument. You decided that obedience mattered more than being right. These decisions reveal a heart that has been trained to value eternal outcomes over immediate satisfaction. God is drawn to hearts that think beyond the moment. You learned that not every misunderstanding requires correction. Some things resolve themselves with time. Some truths surface without effort. When you stopped rushing to be understood, you allowed God to reveal what needed to be revealed. God is the author of clarity. He does not need your anxiety to accomplish it. There is also a humility embedded in silence that God honors profoundly. When you don't insist on being heard, you acknowledge that your perspective is not the center of everything. That humility does not diminish you, it positions you. God lifts those who are willing to lower their own voice so His wisdom can be elevated. You discover that silence can be a form of trust-filled endurance. Endurance is not always loud. Sometimes it looks like staying steady while storms rage around you. Sometimes it looks like refusing to react while pressure builds. That endurance shapes character. Character is what God builds before He releases greater responsibility. Your restraint also guarded your future, words spoken in. Frustration can close doors that patience would have opened. By choosing silence, you kept pathways open that anger would have sealed shut. God sees the future you cannot yet see. When you trust Him with your words, you trust Him with where you are going. You may have felt overlooked in moments when silence kept you from being noticed, but God's system does not overlook what people ignore. What is unseen by others is often what God values most. He works deeply in hidden places. He shapes lives quietly before He ever reveals outcomes publicly. Silence taught you to depend on God's presence rather than on verbal affirmation. When you stopped seeking validation through speech, you learned to rest in being known by God. That rest brought stability. Stability is rare, and God strengthens those who possess it. You also learned that silence can be an act of discipline. Discipline is not punishment, it is training. By training your tongue, you trained your thoughts. By training your thoughts, you trained your responses. God develops leaders through discipline long before influence is visible. There were moments when silence felt uncomfortable, when it stretched you beyond what felt natural, but growth often feels that way. God does not shape you for comfort, He shapes you for purpose. Purpose requires capacity, and capacity is built through choices that challenge your instincts. Your silence protected your testimony. Words spoken rashly can undermine years of faithfulness. By choosing restraint, you preserve the credibility of your walk with God. Credibility is built slowly and lost quickly. God honors those who guard it carefully. You discovered that when you speak less, you hear more. When you hear more, you understand more. When you understand more, you respond better. Silence became a doorway to deeper wisdom. God opens that doorway to those who are willing to pause. There is also a spiritual authority that grows in quiet obedience. Authority is not loud, it is recognized. It carries weight because it is rooted in alignment with God. Your willingness to be silent when speaking was an option strengthened that authority within you. You didn't say what would have fed your pride, and that choice starved something that needed to die so humility could live. God resists pride but draws near to humility. By choosing silence, you made room for His nearness. Your silence did not weaken your voice, it refined it. When you do speak, your words will carry clarity, purpose, and weight because they have been tempered by restraint. God prepares voices in silence before He amplifies them in influence. You also learned that silence can be a form of intercession. When you didn't speak against others, you left space for God to work in their hearts. Judgment spoken hastily can block transformation. Patience allows God to move freely. There is a peace that comes from knowing you do not have to respond to everything. That peace is not avoidance, it is confidence. Confidence that God is present. Confidence that God is active. Confidence that God is faithful. You are becoming someone who does not need to announce strength, because strength has become part of you. You do not need to defend faith loudly, because faith has become steady within you. God is shaping you quietly, deliberately, powerfully. What you didn't say continues to speak. It speaks through your composure. It speaks through your consistency. It speaks through your trust in God when others panic. That unspoken testimony continues to rise, continuing to impress the one who sees beyond words and listens to the language of the heart. There is also this deeper truth that must be understood with clarity. Silence is not the absence of courage. It is courage that has learned self-mastery. Courage is often portrayed as confrontation, but in God's wisdom, courage is just as often restraint. When you had the power to speak and chose not to, you demonstrated dominion over yourself. And dominion over self is the foundation of every other form of strength God entrusts to a person. You are being trained in ways you did not ask for and refined through moments you did not choose. God often uses restraint as a classroom. Every time you held back a word, you were being taught discernment. You were learning the difference between what feels urgent and what is truly important. God is not rushed, and when you aligned yourself with His pace, you stepped into His rhythm. There are truths that do not need defending because they are upheld by God Himself. When you stopped trying to protect truth with your voice, you allowed God to protect it with His authority. God does not need human anxiety to maintain divine order. He needs trust. And trust was exactly what you offered when you chose silence over explanation. You began to understand that words are tools, not weapons. When used carelessly, they injure the one who wields them as much as the one they strike. God teaches his servants to handle words with reverence because words shape environments, relationships, and futures. By choosing restraint, you showed respect for the power God placed within your speech. There were moments when silence felt like surrender, but it was not surrender to defeat, it was surrender to God. And surrender to God is never loss. It is alignment. It is positioning. It is saying, I release control so divine wisdom can take over. God honors surrender because it creates space for him to move without resistance. You also learned that silence reveals intention. When you speak, people hear your words. When you remain silent, God sees your motives. Motives are what he weighs most carefully. You didn't withhold words to manipulate outcomes, you withheld them to remain faithful. That faithfulness matters deeply to God. There is a kind of clarity that comes only after you stop speaking. In the quiet, confusion settles. In the stillness, perspective sharpens. God often waits for the noise to end before he speaks clearly. Because you chose quietness, you positioned yourself to receive insight others never hear. You were learning to trust that God can do in silence what others attempt to do through force. Force creates resistance. Silence creates openness. God moves where hearts are open, not where egos are loud. Your restraint softens spaces where confrontation would have hardened them. You may have noticed that silence also exposed the hearts of others. When you didn't respond, their intentions became clearer. When you didn't argue, truth surfaced naturally. God sometimes uses your silence as a mirror, allowing others to reveal what words would have concealed. There is also a refining fire in silence. It burns impatience. It burns pride. It burns the need to control perception. What remains is purity of intent. God refines before he reveals. You were being refined. You didn't speak when you were tempted to demand fairness, and that taught you to trust God's justice instead. God's justice is not delayed, it is precise. It unfolds at the right moment, in the right way, with the right impact. By choosing silence, you declared confidence in his judgment. Silence also trained you to carry unanswered questions without losing faith. Faith is not certainty about outcomes, it is confidence in God's character. When you stayed quiet despite uncertainty, you showed that your faith was rooted in who God is, not in immediate resolution. You began to understand that peace is not something you negotiate with people, it is something you receive from God. And peace once received must be guarded. Words spoken carelessly can fracture peace instantly. Your restraint protected what God had given you. There is a maturity that comes when you no longer need to narrate your pain to validate it. God sees pain without explanation. He understands grief without description. He counts tears that are never mentioned. Your silence did not hide your struggle from him, it brought it closer. You also discovered that silence sharpens obedience. When you stop speaking, you become more attentive. When you become more attentive, you recognize subtle guidance. God often leads through quiet impressions rather than loud commands. Because you practiced silence, you became more responsive. Your restraint became a form of stewardship. You stewarded your influence, your emotions, your credibility. God entrusts greater influence to those who manage smaller moments well. A restrained tongue signals a disciplined life. You didn't say what would have deepened division. You didn't say what would have fueled misunderstanding. You didn't say what would have satisfied anger but wounded love. That choice aligned you with God's heart because God values restoration more than retaliation. There is also this truth. Silence can be an act of faith-filled waiting. Waiting is not inactivity, it is preparation. While you waited, God worked. While you stayed quiet, he rearranged circumstances. Waiting done in trust accelerates outcomes you could never force. You are learning that God does not rush his process. He shapes you layer by layer, moment by moment. Silence is one of the tools he uses to deepen you. Depth cannot be rushed. Depth is built through patience. Your silence has already changed you. You are less reactive, more grounded, more discerning. These changes are not accidental. They are evidence of God's hand shaping your inner life. You may not see immediate reward for restraint, But reward is not always instant. Sometimes it is cumulative. Every moment of obedience builds toward a future moment of clarity, peace, and divine alignment. You are becoming someone whose presence speaks before words ever do. There is a calm around you, a steadiness within you. That presence was formed in quiet obedience. God is not finished with what He began in you. What started as silence is becoming strength. What felt like withholding is becoming wisdom. What seemed unnoticed is being woven into something purposeful and enduring. And as this truth continues to unfold within you, your silence remains active, alive, and powerful, still declaring trust, still shaping faith, still speaking to God in a language deeper than words. So now let this truth settle deeply within you and refuse to let it pass through you unchanged. Examine your life honestly and without fear. Look at the moments where you have spoken too quickly, reacted too sharply, defended yourself too desperately, and ask yourself whether those words brought you closer to God or pulled you further from His peace. Then look at the moments when you held your tongue, when you swallowed pride, when you trusted God enough to remain quiet, and recognize the strength that was forming in you even when no one applauded it. Let this be the turning point where you stop measuring your power by how loudly you speak and start measuring it by how deeply you trust God. Make the decision to let restraint become worship, patience become prayer, and silence become a sacred space where God shapes your character. Choose to live with intention, to speak only when your words align with truth, wisdom, and purpose, and to remain quiet when silence protects peace and honors God. Walk forward with a renewed awareness that God is not asking you to prove yourself, explain yourself, or defend yourself at every turn. He is asking you to trust Him with your voice, your reputation, your pain, and your future. Let your life reflect a faith so secure that it does not need constant validation, a trust so deep that it does not panic under pressure, and a devotion so real that it shows up in the moments when you choose restraint over reaction. Carry this challenge with you. Before you speak, ask whether your words will glorify God, preserve peace, and reflect wisdom. If they will not, choose silence with confidence, knowing that God is working even when you are not speaking. Let your quiet obedience become your loudest declaration of faith. And as you rise from this moment, step into a life marked by discernment, humility, and unwavering trust in God. Let your silence continue to speak where words cannot. Let your faith continue to grow where explanations fail. Let your heart remain anchored in the assurance that God sees, God knows, and God is pleased when you choose Him over your impulse, His wisdom over your emotion, and His will over your voice.